very good afternoon or good morning to you all, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to this webinar today. My name is Martin, and I work as Education Support Manager here at ACCA, and I'm happy to be joined by Advanced Auditing and Assurance Expert Tutor Affaf Noor on this session. So this session is designed to support you with your AAA exam, and Affaf is here to share her insights to help you prepare for this particular exam. In this session today, we'll cover the recently released March-June 24 examiner's report. We'll have some technical examples from previous exams. We'll share some practical advice for tackling your September exams, as well as address some strategies to avoid common pitfalls in the exam. So please take this opportunity to type in your questions on the Q&A button. We have a team of colleagues in the back end who will be responding to these questions as the webinar continues. And Affaf will have some 10-15 minutes towards the end of the session where she'll pick the most commonly asked questions and respond to them. Now, before I hand over to Affaf, I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping items. So there are a number of buttons at the bottom of your screen, and these will be useful to you in this webinar today. You'll find a help icon that provides resources and information to help you resolve any technical issues that you might experience. There's an icon for the slides and the media player. So you'll need to see both of these during the webinar. So just ensure that these are selected. There is an attendee chat function. You can use that to engage with your fellow webinar attendees. And please note that chat is public, so please don't share any private information on that chat. Now, there's a resource list. So there's an icon that looks like a file symbol. When you click on that, you'll be able to access the resources for today's webinar, including any direct links to the resources we refer to. Now, you can always rearrange your screen to suit you and resize the windows if you need to. And in case you find any technical hitches, if you can't hear or you can't see the video or the slides, please do refresh your browser, and that should help resolve the issue. Don't worry if you miss out on any part of the webinar. You will have access to the recording. You'll receive an email tomorrow with a link to access the recording, so you can always listen in again. So I'm going to hand over to Affaf in a moment, and I'll be back with you towards the end of the session. And just to remind you, put in your questions bright and early, and then we'll have plenty of time to respond to them. So now over to you, Affaf.
Thank you so much, Martin. Hi, everyone. Like Martin said, this is Affaf. I've been teaching advanced audit and assurance for over 15 years now. So I have quite a bit of insight about what the examining team is looking for. And the main purpose of the session today is to sort of share that insight with you so that you're more comfortable with your upcoming exam attempts. We have three main things on the agenda today. We're going to look at the examiner's feedback on where the learners have gone wrong in the recent past. So the March-June 24 exam has been published along with the examiner's report. We're going to be taking a lot of examples from this March-June 24 exam. This is particularly important because there were two questions where the testing format was slightly less common as compared to the other exam attempts. So we're going to be focusing on that. And then towards the end, I'm going to talk about a few tips to manage the rest of your time, the exam, how to focus on your practice, etc. And like Martin said, we are going to have time for live Q&A towards the end as well. So I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have, even if you're taking the exam for the first time or you're a recent student. So without wasting any further time, let's just jump right into it. You must already be comfortable with the fact that Section A of the AAA exam is a 50-mark case study, which has 40 technical marks and 10 professional skills marks. Now, this published exam in particular was slightly different from what we've been seeing. So yes, there was business risk, there were procedures, there was a question on non-compliance with laws and regulations, but the different part was the way risk was tested. So traditionally, risk has been tested, we're talking about risk of material misstatement, as an evaluation question. So you'd read through the entire scenario and pick up the significant risks and evaluate them. Now, in this question in particular, they had identified three areas, and you had to justify why each of these three areas was a significant risk of material misstatement. So we'll talk about, because this is something that has been tested in the past for lesser marks, but now this was tested for a good 14 marks. So we're going to be looking at where the learners went wrong in this attempt and how we can actually improve all those areas as well. So just to start off with the key points that we need to keep in mind as we start attempting the case study. So when your exam starts, or even when you're at the practice stage, the examining team is slightly concerned that you're just skimming through the partner's email and not reading it properly. So it is highly recommended that you do read the partner's email first, because this is how you're going to understand what the requirements are. This is where you're going to be able to allocate time to each requirement. And very, very important for super easy 3 marks, this is where you're going to be able to identify the basis that you have to use for materiality. Now, when I talk about your time allocation, please remember that if you want to pass the AAA exam, you need to try and aim at completing the entire exam. So time allocation should be done for each requirement. So for example, if part A is 10 marks for business risk, after I read through the scenario, a good time to allocate would be 1.5 minutes per mark. So spend 15 minutes in typing up the answer to business risk and then move on to the second part. Even if you think I could have done better, the minute the 15-minute allocation is up for part A, please move on to part B and then C and D. So if you're quite disciplined in your time allocation that you do at the start of the exam, then you have a much higher chance of completing the paper and subsequently a higher chance of passing the exam as well. And since the past few years, the basis of materiality for question number 1 is going to be given in the partner's email. Normally, it's either the profit before tax or revenue or total assets. So make sure you highlight that, because that's what you're going to use in your risk of material misstatement answers as well. Another thing that the examiner has pointed out, and this is something that I remember speaking about earlier this year in another InFocus section as well, that there are interactions between the exhibits that students are missing out on. So as you read the case study in the first go, please be aware that some information in Exhibit 2 might be linked to more information in Exhibit 3 to actually sort of create an answer which gets you the technical and professional skills marks. So for example, and I'm just going to read out the key points over here. In this exam, the March-June 24 exam, this is the level of interaction that you were expected to be alert to. So the client was basically a listed client involved in extraction and retail of oil and gas. In Exhibit 2, which was after the partner's email, you were told that they have a new, so do not miss out on little words, they have a new renewables energy division. And this is because of the growing demand for sustainable energy. The institutional shareholders were basically then commenting on the importance of the company being environmentally sustainable. So they had said that the old-fashioned oil companies are becoming less attractive. Plus, the banks are also now requiring oil and gas companies to invest in renewable fuel technologies as a condition for their financing. So as you're reading through the information, don't just skim through it, because these are keywords which might need to be linked to further information. So this was some extract given in Exhibit 2. Now, in Exhibit 3, you had your projected segmental revenue for the year end. They'd given the total revenue figure, and they'd given the extracts that you see on the screen right now. And if you look at, and this is Exhibit 3, right? So if you look at renewables, it says last year, this was not reported separately. And this year, the forecast from this new division is 15.254 million, right? And now you have to sort of try and bring these two together as you think of risk of material misstatement. So when I'm reading through this information, I'm highlighting this because I can actually connect the dots. So I should be thinking in terms of the accounting treatment for IFRS 8. Now, it is a listed company. They're already doing their reporting on their operating segments, and this is a new one. When I do a calculation, by the way, which gets you additional marks, I can tell that the new division contributes to 14% of total revenue. So this is, again, as I'm reading, I haven't even started the answer yet, but as I'm reading the information, I'm able to sort of understand this is what I'm expected to do. So I know if it's an operating segment, it will become reportable if the revenue is more than 10% of the total revenue. And this is already 14%. But this is the easy part. The more interesting part was, are you sure this is the correct amount? Because, and I've highlighted this in the earlier screen, I know there's pressure from the institutional shareholders who have, of course, a higher percentage of shareholding. There's pressure from the lenders. So, is this really a correctly reported figure? So, and this is where my marks are coming in as well. So, maybe there's potential of management bias. This could have been misclassified. Maybe this is not really renewables energy revenue to begin with. So, this is what the examiner means, and they have been saying this over and over again, that as you read through the case study, even in the first go, please be aware that you are expected to link information across different exhibits so that you can come up with an answer for business risks and ROM, which can get you the technical and professional skills marks. So their feedback was that we feel that quite a lot of learners are missing this interaction between the different exhibits. So we'll now move on to covering each part of the requirement. So like I said, there were 4 parts to this question, the ones that's been published: business risk, ROM, procedures, and then non-compliance. Now, examiners' feedback on business risk has again been quite commonly mentioned in the earlier reports as well. As you read through the scenario, you have to think like the management. So put yourself in the management's shoes and think about what might go wrong in the future. But having said all of this, as you write down your answers or as you extract information to plan your answer, you have to look for business risks which have a higher probability of occurring after any mitigation strategies which are given in this scenario. I'll give you an example, not from this case study, but generally. There was a question a couple of attempts ago where they were using, they were selling perishable food items, and they had refrigerated vans to transport the food. So now, and they had clearly mentioned in the scenario that the vans were refrigerated, it's all checked, it's all working amazingly well. So the risk that the food might actually rot or go bad during the delivery was not a valid business risk because they had already mentioned that this is being managed. In another question, for example, if a company is facing foreign exchange risk and they've mentioned that they already have hedging or forward contracts, then that would not be a significant business risk because it's already being mitigated. So this is again something that was sort of highlighted in the examiner's report, that as you read through the question to pick up business risks, of course, think like the management because that's what BR is, but be alert to information that is more significant. Now, business risk is one of those rare topics in advanced audit and assurance where you get 2 marks per well-evaluated risk. And another gap in the understanding is, what do we mean by a well-evaluated risk? So as you think of the answers, think of this in 3 steps. I need to identify the risk from the scenario. I need to explain its initial implication in terms of what can go wrong. But then I need to evaluate it by talking about how this risk is particularly of a bigger concern for this question. So, chances of non-compliance could lead to fines and therefore a cash outflow. This is just identification and implication. This outflow is going to be a bigger problem for this client because, see, in the question, they don't have a lot of cash already. Or maybe this is like the third occurrence of non compliance, and therefore I'm concerned that the reputation is going to be affected massively because of this. So, when we use the word evaluate in the requirement, you will only get the technical and professional skills marks, all of them available, if you answer your question in these 3 steps. So, as once this session ends, as you go back and look at the answers to all the past exam questions on business risk, you will see how the examiners also give their answer in pretty much the same sequence. Initial implication of what could go wrong for this company, and then how this is bigger for this scenario in particular, and potentially linking it to other information in the case study as well. Now, just to give you an example, and I want you to just take a few seconds to read through this. Again, an extract from the same case study. So the group extracts oil and gas through deep sea oil extraction platforms. This is then transported via land or sea. The transportation of fossil fuels is a widely debated issue, with environmental pressure groups demanding stricter laws to deal with spillages or leaks. Now, the answer pretty much is there, and so the risk is there could be a potential leak, but you need to then convert this into a 2-mark answer. And you start off with identification and implication. So you'd start off by saying the risk is there could be a leak or an accident, which could lead to environmental damage and then affect the reputation negatively. So if you stop over here, you're likely to get just 1 mark because you haven't evaluated the risk. Now, in evaluation, I need to talk about this risk significance for this client in particular. So now link it to what we did at the start as well. So again, this reputational damage is going to affect future investment from institutional shareholders or banks. That's your 2nd mark. Or this could also lead to fines by regulatory authorities, which could then affect my profit and cash flow, more evaluation. So when you're preparing for your upcoming exams and when you're writing down the answers, be it the practice sessions, the mock exam, or the actual exam, please make sure that you've created some link to other information within the question, and that way you'd automatically be getting the 2nd evaluation mark as well. So something that you can sort of keep in mind, because this was something that the examiner has fed back on quite repeatedly. The next one, and this is so as a tutor, I loved this because I thought this made so much sense in terms of course, being a tutor and an auditor, but this was something that you haven't seen a lot. This has been tested in the past exams, but normally it was just, like a 5-6 mark scenario. Now, this time around, there was a whole 14-mark question on a justification of why 3 significant areas had been identified as a significant risk of material misstatements. So again, something that we weren't very familiar with, but the best part is this is very simple. The examiner, again, wanted you to sort of remember what the word significant risk actually means. This is a part of your auditing standards as well, but just to quickly sort of recap, in the simplest of terms, this simply means the chances that a misstatement would actually take place and how big that misstatement would be. So for a risk to be significant, it could have higher chances of happening, it could have a higher impact, or it could be both. So this is something that you need to keep in mind. So as you attempt this question and other questions in the future, so with this, the examining team has gradually come to this point. They started off with testing this as a shorter requirement, then like a bigger one for 14 marks. I'm now going to give you a very useful checklist that you can use going forward. So you read through the scenario, you pick up the information which is given for those three areas, and to evaluate its significance, used the following few points that I'm now going to talk you through very quickly. So, of course, talk about whether this is material by amount. So, in this question in particular, one of the justification of this being a material ROM was because the carrying value was material by amount. If there's any estimation uncertainty involved. So remember, in accounting estimates, there's always some element of uncertainty. And if that's bigger, then this is a significant risk of material misstatement. So, second thing for this question and going forward as well, go through the information and see if there are any estimates involved. So, for this question in particular, there was the element of value in use in impairment. Now, if I revise my accounting knowledge, value in use in simple terms is how much I can earn from these platforms in the future. So, because it's in the future, there's of course uncertainty, and therefore there is going to be a significant ROM over here. So I'm picking up the information and linking it to the content in bold that I'm actually putting in these slides. So another justification was this is significant because value in use involves uncertainty, plus the amortization of licenses have their useful life, which again involves uncertainty. So we've done 2 points up till now. Look for any areas which require a lot of management judgment. So again, this is quite simple. It was there in the answer. We've done this so many times since AA. Depreciation calculation involves management judgment. There is indication that they are under investor pressure, and therefore I'm concerned about management bias. So what am I doing? I'm actually giving you a mini checklist to use to evaluate whether these risks are significant. So by amount, uncertainty, management judgment, management bias, and see if there are any complexities involved in the calculation. So traditionally, since AA, we've had elements like work in progress in inventory is a complex calculation. In this question in particular, we were going to talk about the decommissioning costs. So as we do that calculation, there are lots of complexities involved because we need to look at the time scale, we need to look at the discount factor, and of course, there need to be estimates which are updated regularly. So in addition to the judgment and the uncertainty, this is also a significant risk because it involves complex calculations. And again, this is something that a lot of you might actually not be very comfortable with, but this is being tested increasingly by the examining team, the disclosures. So when we talk about complexities, it's not just in the amounts or the double entries, it is there in the disclosures as well. And for this one in particular, the renewables disclosure or the operating segment disclosure was new. There are no comparatives. So even in that disclosure, I have huge concerns, and therefore this is a significant risk. So all I did was, this is something that we've already known since we started preparing for AAA, but we've just put the two together to give an answer which gets us all the available marks. The examiner feedback was, yes, the requirement is worded in a different manner, but it's exactly the same format as the normal ROM. You need to start off by commenting on whether it is material. You need to talk about the relevant accounting treatment that should have been followed. The risks are where most of my marks were, right? So the judgment, the uncertainty, and all of that. And then talk about the financial statement impact. So at the end of the day, it's the same format. It's the requirement that has been worded differently. And of course, a few more marks in the risks element. I'm just going to show you an example from what we've been saying, just to sort of give it a more practical perspective. So we start off by commenting on whether it is material. I hope you know that you're not allowed to do a percentage calculation of materiality. Right at the start, you would have already done your materiality determination. So if they'd asked you to use profit as the a threshold, you would have done 5%, 10%, and then decided on one amount that you're using. So over here, if you do a calculation, you'll get a zero. But if you simply write, this is material based on our threshold decided, you get a professional skill mark. And then you'd write your accounting treatment. I'm not reading through this because I'm not teaching you anything today. But the idea was that the accounting treatment has to be relevant. So you can't simply say impairment is where the carrying amount is compared with the recoverable amount. Because I'm going to discuss risks in the value in use, in the fair value, etc., that should be my trigger point for making sure I complete the accounting treatment marks as well. So talk about what impairment is, talk about how it is written off first against any obviously impaired assets, and then prorated against the remaining assets. So you normally get about 1 to 1.5 mark for your accounting treatment. So this is my justification following exactly the same format as my normal ROM. The obviously most of the marks were in the justification of the risk. So we start off by saying the recoverable amount is a complex calculation. Lots of marks for value in use. I'm concerned that this involves estimates of the long-term oil and gas prices, which change quite a lot. I'm concerned the costs of operating the platform is again for a longer term in the future. I'm concerned about the complexities in the discount factors. Again, as many points that you can fit in, of course, linking them to the scenario. And ultimately, based on all of that, I'm also concerned that there's some element of management bias. This is a listed company. They're already under pressure. You do get professional skills marks for talking about management bias. And finally, your financial statement impact in terms of under or overstatement. So I'm sort of building up a story that I go and tell the management, right? That's what my ROM is. This is material. This is what IS 36 says. These are my concerns, and therefore, these are the areas which could be under or overstated. So pretty much the same format as ROM. So business risk, very similar. ROM, slightly different, but to be honest, as long as you're comfortable with the techniques, you should be able to handle these questions in the future. The next one was on procedures, and the examining team was quite happy with this element. So you were asked to design the principal audit procedures regarding impairment. Now, they did say that the learners who did not pass these questions were the ones who did not focus on impairment. So only those who were writing inappropriate procedures were not able to get the available professional skills and technical marks. So for impairment, if you've written procedures like look at the minutes of board meetings for a discussion of impairment, physically inspect the platforms, or agree the cost to the invoice, these are all zeros. Because it wasn't about the valuation of the asset, it was about impairment, which is a different accounting aspect. So those who did well focused on relevant procedures. For example, getting a copy of the value in use calculations, making sure the assumptions are reasonable. You need to challenge their assumptions, particularly around the fact that they said that it's too difficult to get the market value. We're auditors, there's professional skepticism. I can't just blindly believe whatever they say. There were marks around testing whether the discount rate was appropriate, and again, the basis of the impairment reversals that were given in the scenario. So students who wrote answers which were focused on impairment, which were focused on gathering better quality evidence related to impairment, were able to get the technical and professional skills marks. I'm sure you know this already, but the best part about AAA is There's nothing extra that you need to do to get the professional skills marks. As long as your technical marks are relevant and you're answering the question and focusing on good quality evidence, you're automatically getting your professional skills marks as well. The last requirement was related to non compliance with laws and regulations. And this is, again, a very commonly tested area. And hopefully, you were comfortable with the approach that you had to take. But I'll tell you what the examiner fed back on. The requirement was discuss the responsibilities of the auditor regarding a suspicious payment. Now, the examiner said most of the students were able to handle this well and consider the impact that the issues might have on audit planning. Now, this is where they said that the students struggled quite a lot. I think there is a video on ACCA's website regarding non-compliance, which talks about the second half, because this is something that the examining team has been concerned about for a very long time. Before I move on to the content of the slide, just listen to me for the next couple of minutes. It'll help in future exams. So in an audit, when you, even if you've never done an audit, when you identify a suspected breach, you need to discuss how this will impact my audit going forward. That's the second part. So, of course, on this breach, I need to carry out further procedures. This also makes me suspicious there could be other breaches as well. This makes me query the reliability of their internal control. I'm concerned about management integrity. This is what they mean about when they say discuss the impact that this has on audit planning. So in terms of the feedback, the examiner said that the second half of the question was not handled well. And everything that I just said earlier is up on your screen now. So you had to consider, with reference to this identified non-compliance, what other evidence would be needed, what this means for management integrity and evidence in other areas. So yes, I've identified this non-compliance, but now I need to be alert that there could be other instances of non-compliances as well. And then you querying your assessment of internal controls. Remember, internal control is just a very, very fancy way of saying systems. So if the systems let them breach one law, my concern is that the systems might not be very reliable, and I need to modify my approach in terms of whether I can rely on these systems to reduce my substantive testing. If after this session today, you go back and attempt all the questions on non-compliance, they always have these points, because this is the implication of an identified breach on audit planning. So again, students who were aware of that were able to get those marks, and if those who weren't, of course, struggled with getting the available marks. So this was, and I understand it was a very fast-forward version. I just wanted to sort of cover as much of the content as possible. So this was their feedback on question number 1. As you get the PDF for the session today, please make sure that you sort of, use these as a checklist to practice for the rest of the time just before your exam. The second question was on ethics. And again, as a tutor, I found this to be a very, very interesting question. So let's stop here for a second and think about what the examining team has been saying. The examining team has said that students are not explaining the ethical threats. They are not evaluating what to do for this particular scenario. So what the examiner did this time was they did an initial ethical evaluation. So they gave you the initial work and said, okay, now you explain it and then tell me what should have been done or what the safeguards should have been. And the second part, which made it very interesting but slightly tricky for you guys, was they tested 2 areas which are not very frequently tested in this much detail. So the entire ethics question did focus on quality control review that we normally just know as a one-line answer, and on audit fee, particularly for private clients. So the examiner feedback was particularly around the same areas that I spoke about. Part A, they had given an initial assessment of the ethical issues and the proposed safeguards, and you were expected to explain the threats and evaluate the safeguards. And if you think they were not appropriate, you had to suggest an alternative. So they did the basic work for you, the ones that you were normally comfortable with, and they wanted you to do the evaluation rather than just the explanation. The feedback was this was a question which was quite poorly handled. Students were not able to explain the threats, and there was a lack of knowledge. Now, your requirements on an engagement quality reviewer, they come from ISQM2 as well, and this is a relatively newer standard in the AAA syllabus. It was added about a few years ago. So this was sort of unexpected for the students. But again, I'll give you a quick checklist to keep in mind for future questions. Now, some knowledge aspects that I want you to please remember and keep in mind for future questions in this one as well. We know that all listed clients must get a quality control review done by an independent partner, someone other than the engagement partner, before the report is signed. So we know that, and you were all comfortable with that. The focus was on the eligibility criteria. This is a person, and you have to evaluate this for the given scenario. This is a person, the quality reviewer, when we say independent, who should not be a member of the engagement team. There were additional marks for talking about and evaluating their competence and their knowledge. So are they senior enough? It's not just about competence, is not just about being qualified, right? They need to be senior enough to actually do that review. The knowledge of their industry and their experience. So if this is a person who's always just audited or done reviews of the banking sector, then maybe they're not the right person for this particular client. They need to be independent, they need to be objective, they need to be unbiased. And the key part that most of you might have missed out on was if you can't find such a person within your firm or your network of firms, then you need to get someone from outside the firm. So again, that was your suggestion, right? You'd go through the scenario, you'd say that the person that they're recommending was already a part of the engagement team or does not seem to have the competence, the knowledge, or the experience, or might not be objective, and they'd mentioned that there's no other appropriate person, then your safeguard or your recommendation would be you need to get someone from outside the firm to do this. So this recap of the knowledge had to be applied to the scenario. So students who were prepared with this did it well, the others struggled. Now, the second part was, again, regarding professional and ethical matters regarding the fee and how this would change when they actually get listed. So the requirement specifically mentioned how this would change or how this would be affected by the proposed listing before they accept appointment as the auditor. The feedback was that the students did not read the requirement carefully. They were not using the scenario to evaluate fee dependence, and they did not write enough to get the available marks. So the mark allocation point basically means they hadn't written enough to actually get the marks that were available. So as always, for future references, this, by the way, all of this was already there on ACCA's Study Hub. So if you had sort of gone through the code of ethics from the Study Hub, you would have picked these up in the exam as well. So lack of knowledge was there. So let's just quickly revise this. This is something I think which has been tested after quite some time in AAA. There is guidance around fee dependence on non-listed clients or private clients as well. So all of you were comfortable with the listed one. You'd not actually learned the private one. So again, very quickly, if it exceeds 30% of the fee for more than 5 years, you need to get an external quality review before or after the issuing the 5th year's audit report. Another point which gets you, by the way, professional skills marks, also review this against the firm's own internal policy. Please remember, we have the code, ACCA and ISBA, which is, of course, my basic code that I have to follow. But then some firms might have their own policies, which are more strict. So your fee dependence has to be evaluated against both. For listed clients, you were all okay with this. For 2 consecutive years, if the fee is more than 15%, then you need to get a quality control review done. And if this continues for 5 years, then you have to stop being an auditor. So those who had that knowledge were able to get all the available marks. Those who hadn't learned these guidelines ultimately struggled in getting the marks. So you can sort of keep this for future reference as well. They also said, the examining team, that the students were not able to pick up the fact that you can't really negotiate a discount in the fee based on the other services that you're offering, because that affects objectivity. So you can't say if it's one service, then 100 million. If it's 5 services, then it's 20 million. That's just simply not allowed. So students were not able to pick up that the basis for that fee were also not appropriately done. I'm slightly conscious of time, so I'm just going to go on to the next one now. The third question is a question that the syllabus guide always outlines. So they have said that one question in section B will always be from the completion and reporting stage of audit. So this was a very typical question. However, part A related to a change in an auditing standard which students had not prepared. So very quickly, yes, this has been tested as a knowledge-based question, but unfortunately, this means going forward, this will now be tested as a scenario-based question. So you might be given a group audit situation where you might be asked to evaluate which of the components need to be worked on as the group auditor. So first part was knowledge-based, second part was matters to be considered, and the third part was justification of an audit opinion. The last two parts are very similar to what has already been tested, so there was nothing new in terms of your answering technique. So like I said earlier, this is your auditing standard on group audits changed a few years ago, and therefore in the upcoming attempts, you need to be slightly alert to applying this now. It has been tested at knowledge-based level. I don't think they'll ask you to do that again. But so the idea is you're the group auditor, you have different components. So you have joint ventures, subsidiaries, associates, you have shared service centers, branches, etc. You have to identify which of these components I need to work on in detail. So the question was, what is the criteria that you use to do this evaluation? See if this requires judgment. See if there is a bigger or a higher risk of material misstatement, which is assessed throughout the audit. So examples include if it's a newly acquired or formed subsidiary or a component, it would be something I need to work on. If it's at the planning stage, if I carried out my analytical procedures and I identified fluctuations which did not make sense. So the revenue for the subsidiary has gone up significantly, but cost of sales have gone down. Now, this doesn't make sense to me. This is going to be a significant component. Components which have had significant transactions with related parties within the group. Any components in the question where control deficiency have been identified. Any components which have had transactions outside the normal course of business, so not stuff that they usually do, and also look at how at the group level, the controls have been implemented to keep an eye on the components. So for this question, March, June 24, this was a knowledge-based question. Literally, what you see on the screen right now was the answer. But going forward, this could now potentially be tested as a scenario question with question number 1 as well. So this is something that they said that the students had not really covered really well in their exam. The second part, which is your matters to consider, has a format which is very similar to ROM. You comment on materiality. Materiality might already be decided and given, in which case you just use that. You talk about the accounting treatment, the risks, and the financial statement impact. And then you have to talk about the evidence. This is something I'm quite particular about. A lot of you would miss out on the marks if you don't cover the what and the why. So as you write down your procedure, please, or evidence, please make sure you write the source and what you're confirming from that source. And ultimately, and I don't think I'm going to go through this in detail, but this was the main scenario which was given. There was a group and they had one of their subsidiaries that they are basically negotiating the sale of. They've set the selling price, they've given the carrying value, they've given the revenue that it contributed, they'd given information that there were conversations happening with potential buyers, but the sale had not yet been finalized. So you had to pick up that this was basically IFRS 5. You had to start off by commenting on materiality. This is something I want to spend just a few minutes on. You had to talk about IFRS 5 for future as well in three aspects. Talk about, are you sure it is a non-current assets held for sale? Then talk about, if yes, is it presented and classified properly? Then talk about the valuation, the impairment, depreciation stopping, and please do not forget to talk about the potential of it being a discontinued operation as well. So the examining team said that a lot of students were not able to cover all aspects. They just covered the initial application of it being an asset held for sale. They did not link it to the scenario. So writing stuff like there is an active program because they're negotiating with buyers. The group management is committed to selling this because negotiations are at an advanced stage. The sale is highly probable because they're a potential purchaser who's already started off with the due diligence. The valuation application had to include impairment, etc. And again, the examiner said that a lot of students completely missed out on this being a discontinued operation. Finally, when we were talking about audit evidence for part B, which was linked to your matters to consider, again, the focus was you have to write evidence which is better quality. So focusing on the main risks, getting evidence that the negotiation is actually happening, getting the impairment view, and then obviously auditing that impairment review, looking at post-year-end events to make sure that the sale is progressing. So the examiner said that students who had written stuff like just board minutes and written representations were not able to get the available marks. Finally, regarding your opinion, this is something which has been coming up quite a lot. When they ask you to justify one opinion and explain the audit report impact, please do not write a variety of opinions. So for this question in particular, there were massive concerns about classification, valuation. So this was pervasive. So only those students who called this pervasive, justified it, spoke about an adverse opinion, were able to get the marks. So if you think you can just write different opinions and maybe they'll give you some marks, that's not going to happen. So pretty much quite repetitive of what they've been saying in the past. Follow the format and do answer what is being asked. Very conscious of time, but this is something that is very, very important. If you're a new student or a retake student, there have been changes in the syllabus, basically with reference to sustainability reporting and assurance. There are 3 excellent technical articles written by the examining team on ACCA's website. Just prepare those 3. There is nothing else that you need to do beyond those 3 articles, particularly the exposure draft on the assurance on sustainability standard that is likely to come up in the upcoming exams. This was specified within the syllabus guideline as well. From now until the exam, if you haven't already done so, please make sure you practice as many past papers as possible. You could use ACCA's practice platform, or you could use a kit like, for example, Kaplan. Make sure you have time managed written practice. Don't just read the question and read the answer. That is a sure shot formula for failure in AAA. So type up the answer. You have the platform to do that. Match your answer to the standard solution, and then, of course, evaluate where you're going wrong. Another thing that I feel is a major factor which will help you in passing the exam is actively reading the solution. So, you have so many technique videos on ACCA's website. I spoke about so many topics in the past half an hour or so. Apply them to your standard answers. That this is what I know. Oh, yes, I can see the technique applied in the standard answers as well. So, again, making sure you're on the right track. Can I just quickly ask, because I have referred to the practice platform quite a lot, just a simple yes and no, and a very honest answer to this one. Do you practice questions on the practice platform? So this is a platform which replicates your actual exam platform. So if you could just vote yes or no, please. And I'll see how many of you. Okay, so there's a huge percentage going towards a yes, which is absolutely amazing. Some towards a no. You still have time. It is only the 15th of August right now. So if you could please make sure that you use that to practice, because trust me, that will get you very comfortable with your actual exam. Another question. What is the pre-September mock and debrief release date? ACCA they have their mocks and they have their debrief videos, which are very, very effective. Could I get you to vote and see if you know this? So the mocks are already available and the debriefs will be available. So yes, again, this is something that I would like to reiterate, that attempting this mock exam will play a huge role in getting you more comfortable with what the actual exam looks like. So please do make sure that you attempt this mock exam, then match it to the answer, watch the debrief videos to see where you might have sort of struggled with a bit. During the exam, and this is something that I've spoken about already, please make sure you allocate time to each requirement. Do not forget the easy marks related to materiality, etc. There are lots of videos on ACCA websites which talk about this, because this would be a huge gap that you can fill simply by making sure you have knowledge of the relevant marks that are always there. And I was meant to keep at least 10 minutes for the Q&A, but apologies to the ACCA team. I knew I was going to overrun this by a few minutes. I'm just going to have a look at the Q&A that have been coming through and see if I can cover the commonly asked ones. Okay, so I've been asked, is it okay to start question number 2 and 3 and then question number 1? Absolutely yes. See, it is completely up to you. I don't have a recommendation really, but whatever you start with, be disciplined about your time management, please. So I would say, like on top of my head, 1 hour, 45 minutes for question number 1. Keep that aside, and 1.5 hours divided equally for the rest of the 2 questions. So start with whatever question you want, as long as you are quite sure that you would actually stick to your allocated time. Like I said at the start, you complete the paper and your chances of passing the exam go up automatically. So that quite a few of the questions were around this area. Okay, so how is materiality level set for a high-risk client, and how is the client assessed as high risk? So remember the relationship that you did in audit and assurance, if the risk goes up, your materiality has to go down. So if the range is 5 to 10%, it's a risky client, choose the lower end, which is 5%. The idea is if it's a risky client, there are more higher chances of fraud and error. Therefore, even a small amount becomes material for me. How do you assess whether a client is risky? Can I be very honest? It's a risk question. It will be a risky client. But your justification has to come from the scenario. So you can't simply write, this is a risky client, therefore I'm setting it at 5% of PBT. Give 1 or 2 points from the scenario. So this is a risky client because maybe it's a new client. If it's not a new client, because it involves areas of judgment and estimate like value in use, and therefore I'm setting it at 5%. So the mark for justification will only be given if it is linked to the scenario. So justify, it will always be a risky client because it's a risk question. But your justification has to come from the scenario. Another question that I'm asked quite a lot, how much is enough to get a full mark? It is literally dependent on each topic. So for materiality, for risk, it is just answer what is being asked and you don't have to write too much. So I don't have the number of sentences that you can write, but the key is simply writing for impairment, carrying value, recoverable amount is this and this. That gets you your 1 mark. So there's no number of sentences that you need to write to get that mark. For audit procedures and audit evidence, there are no formula, it's a technique. You think of the accounting treatment that should have been followed and then confirm the treatment through the procedures. So how can I confirm the carrying value? How can I confirm the assumptions that have been used in value in use? So there's no formula, but you have to think of the accounting treatment and apply your audit procedures to confirm that treatment. When using auditor, does content be more important rather than format of paragraphs? Okay, I got that. So is format more important than content? The answer is no. In question number 1, you get communication marks for writing to, from, subject, introduction, which is your briefing note format. You get communication marks for making sure you write in paragraphs and give a few headings, but that's about it. So you have, other than those communication marks in question number 1, the focus has to be on answering the requirement. But having said that, just make sure you write different points and different lines and you're actually good to go. I'm doing the UK version while referring to the accounting standard. Okay, so if you're doing the UK version, most of it is similar to your IFRS. But if there's a particular topic which is different in the UK version, for example, the code differs, the reporting audit reports, there are different elements, then you don't still need to refer to them. So there are no marks for saying IFRS or the FRC code or the FRC ethical standard. The marks are for saying what the content actually is. But yes, for the UK version, you will have to refer to the relevant accounting treatment or the audit report format required by the UK standards. If you have a qualitative risk, that is, the risk may not be material but may affect the quality of accounts. Oh yeah, so that would be material by nature. So Nicola, a lot of the risks are material by nature because maybe they relate to an estimate, maybe they relate to disclosures, maybe they relate to an accounting standard that they're applying for the very first time in their financial statements, then yes. So risks could be material. So, the magnitude, that's not just by amount, it could be by nature as well. EPSM and Foundations in Professionalism course can help in AAA with regards to your ethical element. So if you've done that, then it will make it easier for you to attempt your questions on ethics. Yes. Another question is, do we need to explain accounting treatments? Yes. For matters to consider for risk of material misstatement, questions like this, yes, you get a mark for explaining the accounting treatment. Martin, stop me whenever you want. I think I have another minute. I'll just answer more questions, then I'll hand it over to you. When writing the exam, is it more preferable by examiners to be a bullet point or a paragraph? It's exactly the same. So if you just type up, so Emma, if you mean by bullet the dashes or the dots, it doesn't matter. I would not recommend putting that. Just write one procedure, space the next one, space the next one. So that automatically becomes the bullet or the paragraph and covers everything really. Martin, I'll just take one more and then I'll finish off. Okay, so what if the question says to deal with the particular exhibit? Do we still link? Amanda, thank you for asking this. No, you don't. The risk question would always ask you to refer to more than one exhibit because that's how the linkages will be created. And that's where the linkages have to be done. But normally, parts C or D might just direct you towards one particular exhibit and you just stick to that. And with that, I think I'll stop. I'm so sorry. I knew when I was creating the slides that I'm going to be running short of time, but I wanted to cover all the feedback. So I'm so sorry for not being able to cover all the questions. Martin, back to you.
Thank you, Affaf. And I'll not let you off the hook as yet. There's a question that has come in from a number of students.
Okay.
And that's around students who are attempting the exam maybe the second or third times. They have attempted and not passed before. Do you have any tips for them that they can use this time round?
Absolutely. You start and end your preparation on the practice platform. So your entire preparation needs to revolve around written practice. And ACCA, they've done their questions topic-wise. And just start from the very first one and attempt it. And then please do make sure that you do lots of written practice and compare it with the answers. So if you've passed, if you've failed between 41 to 49, then you have the knowledge. You're either not completing the paper or you're not comfortable with the answering techniques. For both these scenarios, the answer is written practice through either the practice platform, if you're with the learning partner, then of course through their own platforms. If you failed at less than 40, then you'll have to first revise from the study hub or whatever content that you're using for your preparation, could be study text like Kaplan, and then move on to your practice. So depending on which range you failed at, your practice for the rest of the session would be changed according to that.
All right. Thank you so much, Affaf, for those great insights. And that's lots of information there. I do hope the students found it useful. And thank you so much for the attendees as well for joining in and engaging with us. We do hope you found the information session useful and that it will go a long way in helping you prepare for your exams. Just a quick reminder that the recording of this session will be available from tomorrow. You can always listen in again. And just reiterate once more that the mocks, the pre-September mocks are available. Please get into the practice platform, do the mock to time, self-mark, and review the model answer and marking guidelines, see where you went wrong, see where your areas of weakness are, and improve on that with the time that we have between now and the exam. From the rest of us here at ACCA, best of luck in your preparation and all the best in your exams. Thank you and bye for now.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.